Sorry, I got some here. Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right. Is it working? Man, look at us. Thank you, Scotty. Kind of feel like a mixture between Britney Spears and a bug when you put this thing on, because it's out in front of you anyways. Okay, well now we can start. Good morning. I'm glad that you're here. We are going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 2 today. Now, it's been a minute since we've had this class, and so, good morning. It's been a minute since we've had this class, and so if you're like me, you might be a little bit lost on where we were. It's been, I think, 2 weeks. It's been 4 weeks since I've been here. I've been a little absent, had some things going on, relatively minor, but we're back. And so, but we're back. So, I want to do a quick recap, at least of what Jeremy got. I appreciate Adam and Jeremy covering those classes for me while I was gone. I made sure to text Adam after he made a dig in the beginning of his class about how we haven't gotten very far in 2 weeks, and then he didn't get through all his material. And I said, hey, that was my favorite part of the class, I think. And then as I was preparing for this one, didn't get not even close to as far as I wanted to get, and I thought this is why Adam made the joke. So we're going to recap, though. In the beginning of chapter 2, Jeremy got through he got through like 2 verses, but we're going to say he got through 4 verses because we read the last 2 of that section. And so we want to do a quick recap just of verses 1 through 4, and it will be fast. This is what Paul writes. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So quickly, so Jeremy started, all right, first of all, is this like the most important thing, or is this just first in the list? I think that this is the first thing we're going to talk about, and we're going to get moving. But he says, first of all, he says, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men. So pray for all men, even those who are in office, who are oppressive. And he says that the goal is to live tranquil and quiet lives, so that others see their lives and see that they're full of godliness and dignity. Now, their current circumstances are certainly not tranquil or quiet or peaceful, considering the Roman oppression that they're facing and really are soon to face even more of. So it appears that Paul finds this kind of tranquil and quiet life possible through prayer. It's certainly not there now, but it could be through prayer. So he says to pray. And I guess just a side note of sometimes I hear people talk about like it would be better almost. This is not really what they say, but it would almost be better if we were being persecuted right now, because the church seemed to grow under persecution, and while that is certainly true, the church did grow while they were being persecuted. Lack of comfort, right? You had to commit. Well, Paul is certainly not praying for that. I think Paul would say, what in the world? You have no idea what we're facing right now. Why would you pray? Why would you want that? Paul is saying we should be praying to live tranquil and quiet lives. We're trying to change the circumstances here. Verses 3 and 4. He says these kinds of prayers for all people. Notice all the alls. I kind of circled them. We'll see them on the next slide too. All the alls here. He says this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, which this kind of, that phrase, you might recognize from just some Old Testament when it describes sacrifices. We're talking about something that's good and acceptable, pleasing in the eyes of God. Leviticus 1:3 kind of talks about that. And then if you fast forward to Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where he says, therefore I appeal to you, brothers, to be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, pleasing to God. And so that's kind of how the living sacrifice that we all collectively are supposed to be, that's how it's described as well, as a sacrifice to God that is pleasing and acceptable to Him. And so we see going through this quickly, God desires all men to be saved, including kings, authorities, and those who see the godliness and dignity of the church. And God also desires for all men to understand the truth, the gospel, rather than false teachings and these kind of out there beliefs that are circulating around that Paul is combating a little bit throughout the letter. Okay, now let's get through verses 5 through 7. Paul's going to give us a bit of a theological statement here and then say, this is what I was appointed to speak. So, he says, "For there is one God and one mediator also between God and men, the man, Jesus Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all, the testimony given at the proper time. For this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle," I'm telling the truth, I am not lying, "as a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth." So though God desires all men to be saved, we get a little bit of a contrast because there's only one God and one mediator. So he's gone through all these alls, but for there is only one God and one mediator through which we speak to God. Jesus, the mediator, is the one who gave himself as a ransom for the sins of all. So this phrase here, there is one God, it's kind of rooted in, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." I think that Paul is playing on this idea, which is, it's called the Shema. It's like a really, really big deal in Judaism. If you know about the Old Testament, you probably know like this is really important to them, this phrase and this verse. And so Paul, I think, is playing on this phrase here. He uses the kind of the same words. And when Jews say this phrase, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, they're using it to reject the existence of any other God. And that is absolutely true, and Paul uses that phrase in that way in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. But in this way, he's using it a little bit differently. It's more similar to like Galatians chapter 3, verse 20, and Ephesians chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, where Paul uses this phrase, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He uses it to show that through this one God, all have access to salvation, to one salvation. There is no other God, and there is no other way to salvation, but all are welcome to access it through the one man, Christ Jesus. So Paul's focus, and I think we talked about this maybe in our intro class, or maybe the first class on text, but Paul's focus in 1 Timothy is on the man Christ Jesus, which is why he is talking about Jesus that way here. His focus is not as much on Jesus' greatness as God and his deity, but rather his function as the perfect man who paid the price of sins. And that's more of Paul really focuses on the humanity of Jesus in this letter. So this testimony, he says, who gave himself as a ransom for all, the testimony given at the proper time. This testimony is the gospel. And it's the gospel that Paul is commissioned with telling others. So this proper time, or literally it's like in its own time, where God has chosen to make this testimony known to Paul. And I think this just shows that Paul is really a part of God's plan here. Paul has been a part of God's plan to go and to teach the Gentiles, which is what God says in Acts chapter 9, verse 15. Like, I chose Paul for a reason. He's going to be my instrument to go into all the nations, to all the Gentiles. He's part of the plan. And so Paul says in verse 7, for this testimony that I was given, for this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle. I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying. As a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. And so he's given 3 titles here. Now, there have already been some who try to put Paul's teachings, or the gospel really, aside for their own teachings of the law, right? We saw that in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 8, these false teachers. And so we've already recognized some people are trying to kind of toss Paul's teachings out the window and teach their own things about the law. And so Paul recognizes this, I think, attack against his authority as an apostle given by God, and brings this section full circle by reminding Timothy and all those, remember, who are listening, who are being read this letter, that God chose the time in which he would be told the testimony, since Paul had been a part of God's whole plan. Acts chapter 9, verse 15. And he's given these three titles. The first one that he says is preacher, which I thought was kind of interesting because I would think like apostle is kind of the coolest one, for lack of a better word. Like I would use the apostle first because I'm like, hey, by the way, I'm an apostle. I also preach the word. He uses preacher first. And so I think that tells us maybe that's Paul's in this section here. This is his primary focus. It appears to be, at least in this section, proclaiming the gospel, telling people the testimony he was given. That's the title that comes first. Well, then you have apostle. And it's a title that provides him the authority from God. And I think it's worth noting that Paul includes this phrase of defense about his apostleship, this whole like, I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying, which growing up, I've always read this verse and been like, Paul, I didn't think you were lying. Like, why'd you have to say that? But he's not writing necessarily to me. He's writing to this audience. And so what he's doing, he's trying to tell them, like, he uses this phrase when he's trying to defend himself, his apostleship. Like, I'm not lying here. I am an apostle. And he uses it in multiple places, Romans, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, places where he's challenged. And the last title is teacher. He is the teacher of the Gentiles. This is, the function of the apostle, right, is to teach, to carry out the message to the Gentiles. This is his purpose, and he does so in faith and truth. Paul's faithful to his task. All right, now let's get into verse 8, and this is where we're going to start spending a little bit more time. We're going to spend some time in verse 8, some time in verses 9 and 10, and we'll talk about a few things, and then we'll probably set ourselves up to talk about verses 11 through 15 next class. Verse 8 says, therefore, so he's connecting this last thought to here. He says, therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. And so Paul kind of goes on this short theological, tangent is the right word, but he kind of shoots off, says this, and he gets back on the train here. Says, all right, now first thing I said was, I urge you or I want you to pray for the kings and the authorities, for all men, because God desires all men to be saved. Let me tell you about that for a second. Okay, now back to it. Therefore, this is how I want the men to pray in the congregation. And so beginning with how men pray in the assembly, there appears to be an issue. They're praying with stained hands. Now, of course, this isn't literal, like, got pen ink or something on your hands. Not literal here. Well, metaphorically, they're praying and they have wrath and dissension on their hands among men. And it's causing them to be impure. So let's walk through this text that I think might be often ignored and kind of skipped for what's before or after. And so let's talk about this verse and get a better idea of what this means. All right, first, he says, therefore, I want the men in every place to pray. Okay, so I've been really trying to dig into some of this 1 Timothy stuff to get an idea of like, what do people on the other side say so we can better prepare ourselves for how we defend and whatnot. And one thing I've heard a lot is when Paul says, I want, it's very different than when Paul says, this is how it should be. And so when we get to this verse, and he says, therefore, I want the men in every place to pray. My question for you, and if you have any comments on this, then open up here, is this a request that Paul is making of the church in Ephesus, or is this a command where Paul is saying this is how men should pray? It's a command. That's true, and so you get Paul's authority, right? Like it's not necessarily just Paul speaking. This is the Holy Spirit who has inspired Paul to write. And so that is certainly a factor to always keep in mind. What else? Is there a difference between Paul saying, I want this to happen, and this is how it should be? Is it a command or a request? Okay, so, and Ms. Nels is absolutely right. Some people will look at this, like I said, and say, wow, this is just a request here. And really not even about this much, about this verse, as much as a verse to come, but I'm trying to point out the inconsistencies now. We're preparing ourselves. The question is this a request of Paul, or do we consider this to be a universal fact? Men should pray in this manner. Now, of course, we know this is a universal expectation. And when I say universal, I just mean this is not just for the church in Ephesus. This is for Christians who are reading this passage. This is how We should pray. This is how men should pray in the assembly. And so we know that to be true. When God's people go before him in prayer, this is how they should pray. Now, I want you to keep that in mind for later, because we're going to get some verses that people really finagle with that, and we're going to look back at this and say, oh, remember this. Anyways, we'll get there when we get there. All right, he says, therefore, I want the men in every place to pray. Now, I read one thing where, this kind of calls us back to chapter 2, verse 1, where Paul says, I want you to pray on behalf of all men. And so we're still getting this kind of universal idea of like we're praying for all men and in every place. And so the idea is kind of a constant, maybe not so much a constant prayer as much as you are constantly God's. You are constantly good and pleasing to him. You know, the gospel is for all, and God's people are to carry that gospel in every place. And so you can look, if you really want to nerd out about some of this stuff, you can maybe look into Malachi chapter 1, verse 11, see the whole in every place thing. Study is the idea of prayer and praise present in Malachi when he's talking about sacrifice and incense. We're not going to talk about that this morning, but I came across that, looked into it a little bit, thought it might be interesting for some of you who want to go and dig a little deeper this week. Now, to understand the lifting up holy hands part, I think we've got to understand a little bit of biblical background. So, lifting hands in prayer was done throughout the Bible when people pray. Namely, when one was wanting God's intervention or when they're blessing someone else. I have some of those examples on the screen. Luke chapter 24, verse 50. Excuse me. Jesus, with his apostles, he says that he lifts his hands and he blesses his apostles. In Psalms 134, verse 3, and 141, verse 2, talks about the lifting of hands to God. And so lifting hands was just a way for man to put a little more emphasis on what was being said through their posture. That was kind of their goal, at least. Is for man, they're emphasizing it just a little more. However, Paul does not require that men simply lift their hands when they pray. He is not saying, when you're in the assembly, you need to put your hands up. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying, like, if you really want to emphasize your prayers in the assembly, then put your hands up, and if you lift them high enough, God's going to hear you even more. And so he's not commanding them physically, lift up your hands. He's saying to lift holy hands. Okay, well, what does holy hands mean? Well, for Aaron and his sons to enter the tent of meeting, Exodus chapter 30, verses 19 through 21, they had to wash their hands and their feet. And I don't think that this was so that they could keep the rug on the inside clean, which I don't actually know if there's a rug on the inside of the tent of meeting, but just for the point, I don't think it's because like their feet were dirty and they're trying to keep everything clean in there, maybe a little bit. Much more so, it was so that this physical act of washing was representative of their inward purity, holiness. They were in a right state to enter God's presence. And so just as how, in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 15, how bloody or stained hands represents impurity or unholiness, holy hands gives the kind of a metaphorical picture of inward or spiritual purity. And we see that in other letters from the first century that aren't the Bible, and we also see it even in Psalms 26, verse 6, 73, verse 13, where pure hands represent a pure person. Holy hands represent a holy person. So, Paul is not providing some sort of cultural instruction here about, hey, everybody should be lifting up their hands when they pray in Ephesus. All the men, when they pray, they should be lifting up their hands. Nor is he saying that all men should just, this is not just a cultural instruction, and it's not just men should always be lifting their hands when they publicly pray. What he's saying is, and this is for all, that when you come before God in prayer, ensure that you are prepared to come before the King. You've got holy hands. If you're going to enter the presence of the Holy One, ensure that you yourself, you're washed. And we get that idea in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 18 through 23 about how Jesus washes us. He purifies us so that we can enter the presence of God, right? Now, what was the cause of the stain, quote unquote, right? The impure hands. What was the cause of the stain? Wrath and dissension. Well, this seems to be a problem with the men of the church in Ephesus, I assume, or else Paul wouldn't be talking about it, right? And so we don't know exactly, I don't know exactly, maybe someone does. I don't know exactly what's happening in the church. I don't know why these men are angry, why they are contentious with one another. We don't really know. We can just assume it must be happening because Paul he knows the church in Ephesus, and he's saying, hey, men, here's your specific instruction. Make sure that your hands are pure when you pray. You are lifting holy hands, and don't be wrathful. Don't be angry and unforgiving. Well, why are these stains? Why is this such a big deal? Well, the presence of wrath and dissension or contention, when you might translate it, it assumes the absence of virtues, right? Like self-control and forgiveness and kindness and love and patience. All of these are necessary to have good relationships with people who are God's and people who aren't, and with God, if you're going to have a relationship with God. And so your condition when coming before God, we already know this, it affects your prayers. You see that in James. We see that in 1 Peter chapter 3. And the prayer of a righteous person avails or does much, right? And so what he's saying is, when you go before God, you've got stains in your hands, and those stains are you're unforgiving, you're angry all the time. You know, in Mark chapter 11, verse 25, Jesus talks about this. He says, if you are not forgiving someone, then you need to go make it right with that person before coming before God. And that makes sense, right? How could the creation be angry with the creation and then go before the Creator, who is all-loving and completely forgiving, and has forgiven so much more than what we could possibly have hurt ourselves or harbor anger? Like, this is such a, it's kind of an obvious, how could you go before the God who loves all while angry with one of His people? Makes no sense. So he's saying, men, this is your specific instruction. Be in the right spiritual state before approaching God in prayer. Okay. Now verse 9. And I should pause and say, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to stop me. But we're going to get into verse 9. So now we get Paul turning to women. I don't think that some people will say, now we're talking about wives, because the word is like you can be wives or women. You kind of have to tell on context. I don't think that's the case. People, man, there's all kinds of, there's some arguments out there. Like, we're testing every little hole. I think it's women. Anyways, we'll talk about that when we get there. Paul now turns to women to discuss their demeanor in worship. And he's going to say a couple things about women, verses 9 and 10, and then verses 11 and 12. And both of them kind of include a positive command, do this, and then a negative command, not like this, don't do this. And so we'll see that just in this verse first. Verse 9, likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women, making a claim to godliness. So the first command is a positive command. Adorn yourselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, or with self-control, which I think is actually better. That's what, if you see on the screen, the NV, that's Nate version, with modesty and self-control. Okay, now what do we mean by modestly and discreetly, or with self-control? Well, modesty is the desire for one to look inward, for one to look at the inward rather than the outward. I want you to see what's in here and not out here. And immodesty can appear in multiple different ways. It can appear as, whenever someone says modestly, and this is probably what all our minds go to, it can appear as you're not wearing enough clothes, so you call attention to your body. Or by wearing a $500 suit, which, by the way, is like normal now. It's like an average price. It's crazy. But we're wearing a $500 suit to a church where Sunday overalls is the norm. And you're doing that for the purpose of, I want people to look at me, see that I'm different, to show that I've got some money. That would be immodest. So it can appear in both ways. Modesty is much more than simply just the clothes you wear, though. It's the posture of your heart. Is it turned to God, or is it self-seeking? And how does that posture of your heart reflect your time, your clothes, your money, your talents, etc.? Blake Clifton is leading the singing this morning. Good morning, Blake. He's holding his baby right now. And Blake has a nice voice. One might describe his voice as irrepressible, inimitable, indefatigable, and otherwise bulletproof. But, thank you, Bob. I had to memorize that. But If Blake were to get up this morning, and in his first song, he says, okay, everybody, actually, for the first verse, I just don't want anybody to sing. I'm just going to be the only one to sing. And this is really going to get everybody in the context of worship here. Everybody's minds are going to be right after listening to me sing this first verse, because I've got a good voice. And then, all of you jump in on the second verse, and we'll all sing together. Well, you'd have a lot of thoughts, and a lot of words come to mind. I don't know if that's immodest would be one of them. Probably not. And if that were to happen, and I was in the audience, that would probably not be in the first 5 descriptions that come to mind. But it might be one of the most fitting, in that you've got a talent, and instead of glorifying God with that talent, you want people to just look at the talent. You don't want people to look at why you're using the talent and who you are using the talent for. You just want people to see you and your talent. It's immodest. And so immodest and modesty can appear in multiple different ways. Now, for this instance, Paul is referencing, when he's referencing modesty here, of course, it's obvious, and we're going to talk about this in some detail in a second. He's talking about how these women are dressing. But really what he's getting at is the heart of these women when choosing to dress. Why are you choosing these things? That's the problem. The problem is not that you have jewelry. The problem is that you are wearing jewelry to this place just for the purpose of showing people, I've got this fancy jewelry. And I want to elevate myself. That is immodest. So, Paul also includes discreetly, which we're gonna call self-control. Paul includes self-control in his description of how they should conduct themselves when choosing what to wear. Why? Well, because if you have the ability to raise your status and gain attention, it could be tempting to take advantage of that. So self-control, in this instance, requires women to reject adorning themselves like some of the women around them, reject dressing for their own pride, and instead dress so that the inward, holiness, is prioritized over the outward, vanity. So Paul expects women to dress modestly. Now, what's the issue they're facing? And what does that look like for them? And what is proper clothing? And what is improper? And what is considered modest for them? Now, understand these things with the limited amount of understanding that we might be able to have. We got to evaluate their culture. Why? Because reading this, nobody's going to look and say, if someone here this morning has braided hair, nobody's going to say, okay, can you calm down? Like, I know you're rich. Yeah, I see you got braided hair. Nobody's going to do that because it's normal. And so this has to be some kind of cultural thing. So what are we talking about? Now, it's hard for us to determine specifically every little detail here, which is, I love when I can get a really clear-cut, like, every little detail answer. You kind of just can't in most things, I feel like. But it's hard for us to determine specifically every little detail of what's happening. So it's possible this has to do with, kind of how Paul describes younger widows in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 11, when he says, when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. And this is why Paul says, and we'll get there when we get there, that's why Paul says, don't give them support yet, because they're going to want to go get married later. Of wives, we know this from an old source. Of wives, one who loved adorning herself, outer, jewelry and whatnot, was considered unfaithful to her husband. Why? Well, I would imagine it's because she's desiring the gaze of others. Now, whether she's actually unfaithful or not, if we're having that discussion, is kind of beside the point for us. Because for them, it was immodest. So you don't wear it. It shouldn't be worn. So some scholars say that wives were supposed to wear garments called stolas, and they covered a little bit more, and it was more of a dignified clothing. And then some of these women were deciding instead to wear togas, which were seen as more sexually promiscuous and showed a little more, and you were kind of seen as oh, you're wearing a toga? And so some of these women were wearing togas, and this is the kind of stuff maybe what we know is there is some immodest apparel that these women are putting on, and there's probably multiple different contexts that we can see all these things happening. Okay, what's the negative command? He says, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly. Here's the negative command. Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. So what Paul mentions is solely in regard to riches. And it's certainly possible that there's some sexual promiscuity, and how they dress as well, based on some of the things that we might know about the cultural movement. Kind of talked about that in our first class regarding women. However, Paul's just focused on right now how they present themselves in regard to kind of their status, specifically their financial status. So let's talk about a couple of these things. He says, braided hair and gold. Okay, so some people will, this is a nitty-gritty, thing. But some people will talk about braided hair, golden pearls, and expensive clothing. But there's an and in between braided hair and gold. So this is how I take it. Braided hair is not just kind of like we're doing a little three, whatever it's called, braid, and you just got to braid. There's a name for this that I'm missing. Anyways, but there's a braid, and it's really normal looking. We're not talking about just a normal looking little braid. What we're talking about is like an elaborate, and I really don't even know what to picture with this. I don't even know how to do that braid thing that I was just talking about. But an elaborate hairstyle, and it's like plated with gold, which is why I think maybe that's why it includes the little gold section, because there's all kinds of stuff going on with some of these women's hair. And it's elaborate, and it was supposed to draw attention to their hair. And so he's saying, hey, you women who are not doing the traditional hairstyles, which are just normal for everybody, but instead tossing gold in your hair and fixing them all up crazy, and I don't really know. Don't do that, because it's immodest. You're portraying yourself as rich and fancy, and you don't need to do that. Okay? Braided hair and gold. He says, or pearls, or costly garments. And we know the value of pearls, right? Not just that it's jewelry, but that pearls are very valuable in this time. We know that when we kind of study when Jesus talks about the one pearl, right? But here we're saying wearing pearls, wearing fancy garments, expensive clothing. The picture painted by Paul is one where the woman is so kind of full of herself that she is drawing attention, all the attention, to her body and her status by any means that she can. What options do I have here? Let's fix up my hair as fancy as I can. Let's toss on all the jewelry I can and wear really expensive clothing. And so Paul says, instead, here's your positive command again. Verse 10, but rather, by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. So he says, instead, takes the same word, adorn yourselves, they should adorn themselves, with good works. Paul provides this other positive command. Clothe yourselves, adorn yourselves, in something better than vanity, which is good works. So Paul's been talking about behavior this whole time. And though he's mentioning in specific ways that women are immodestly clothing themselves, he's really talking about a lack of self-control and modesty. They're prideful. And here he says, reject that pride, be self-controlled and modest, and then prioritize good works, your behavior. One who has faith must act as someone who is faithful, not just look like some rich, wealthy person who says, I have faith. And so Paul provides a reason that they should prioritize good works at the end of this verse. They are people who claim to be godly. How can you make a claim to godliness with everyone who sees you as immodest? Especially those who are wives, bringing dishonor to their husbands. How can you, in all this is happening, also say, hey, you should follow Jesus? They're profaning the gospel. Isaiah 1 talks about kind of what that looks like a little bit, but here, they're profaning the gospel. They're hindering its spread in Ephesus, and how they present themselves, while also professing to be Christians. Okay, now we're not going to get into verses 11 and 12, because if you haven't noticed, we have like 7 minutes, and Adam is right. I can never get through all my material. and I knew this when I was writing it, that we're not going to get there. And so this is what I do want to do. I do want to set us up for it, because we got a few minutes, and I want to make sure our mind's in the right place, so that in a week from now, you can be in the same mental state and remember everything we talked about. Verses 11 and 12. First, let's read it together. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. And let's actually read, if you've got your Bibles, I don't have this on the screen. Let's actually continue reading. Verse 13. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctify with self-restraint. All right. Quick thing. let me just go ahead and tell you, we're never going to get to 2 Timothy. We might not even get through 1 Timothy, but we're definitely not going to get to 2. So we'll really talk about this verse, and this verses 11 through 15 is all we're going to talk about next week. But let me go on a quick, before moving ahead, we need to talk about this principle. In this section on women, it's obviously very controversial in the religious world, right? I probably don't need to tell you this. Scholars are on all sides of it. So is the Western church, generally speaking. And so I do not need to tell you about all these differences that arise in the text, because I'm sure that you're probably pretty aware. And you probably know that in America we've had the feminist movement, and it's caused our culture to be a lot more sensitive to anything that, quote-unquote, limits women. It kind of says women can do everything men can do do everything women can do, and you're intolerant if you believe otherwise. And so out of fear of being intolerant and a desire to be, quote, loving and, quote, inclusive, a lot of our brotherhood has said, we're going to, quote, lots of air quotes today, restudy this. And now we've changed our minds, actually, and we actually think that this is what it says. There's a lot of cultural influence here in America. Now, we probably know all this to be true. Okay, now as a result, here's where we come into play. As a result of this, sometimes in the church, we might push back against anything that remotely resembles their argument. And so, for instance, this is what I mean. Oftentimes when people, quote, again, restudy this, some will say their conclusion will be, well, look, this is all a cultural thing. It's limited to Ephesus and Corinth, 1 Corinthians 11. So they'll point to a number of arguments, history and grammar and all kinds of stuff, and say that Paul only meant for this to be the church in Ephesus. And some of these arguments we'll address, and some of them are so outlandish that we're just going to kind of ignore it. Now, because of that, I have read and heard members of the church who go through this text and kind of disregard all cultural elements and then say something like, well, why would Paul write this? Doesn't really matter. You know, this is inspired text. We don't need to know why he wrote it. Now, let me preface. That's true. Miss Nell is right. The Spirit inspired this text, okay? And so by no means am I saying we're throwing that out. But in fact, it's to be most relevant in our minds. But God also He allowed men to use their personalities and their writing abilities and their brains. And Paul, in his brain, very much knows what's happening in Ephesus. And if you notice, this whole class we've been talking about, why would Paul write this? Well, we know that this is happening in Ephesus. This is the problem he's addressing, and this is why he says it, and it applies to everybody, right? We've done that like 2 or 3 times so far. He knows Ephesus and what they struggle with, and he's correcting some things. So I think we would be ignorant to say that this command has nothing to do with the Ephesian culture. And I don't think we have to be scared to say that the Ephesian culture has a part to play in this instruction. Now, Nate, are you about to go crazy and teach something false right now? No. What I'm saying is, I think we miss out on some understanding of the text in its fullest extent if we interpret this verse thinking either this is a cultural command or it's a universal command and has nothing to do with the Ephesian culture. That's an either-or mentality. And what I propose is a both-and mentality, which is, what if Paul commands this of the church in Ephesus because there are some cultural things happening with women, and he's aware of that, and it's causing women to think maybe we should take leadership here in the church and take some roles in the church in Ephesus that were never prescribed to us. And so Paul corrects the church in Ephesus from straying from this teaching that's already existed, and it's a universal truth. And it's got a pattern dating back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So let me give you an example. If I see little Tommy cross the street, and little Tommy doesn't look both ways before he crosses the street, and I say, hey, little Tommy, look both ways before you cross the street, are you going to say, oh, well, Nate just said that to little Tommy because he didn't look both ways, but it doesn't really matter to anybody else. Everybody else can walk across the street and not look both ways. No, everyone needs to look both ways before crossing the street. But little Tommy didn't. So I'm telling Tommy, little Tommy, hey, look both ways. Another example. Cherry mentioned this on Wednesday. Modern Christianity, especially after COVID, has begun this kind of false thinking that I could be a Christian, but I can also stay at home. I can be a Christian but not be a part of the church and not a part of the body of Christ. And it states that I can have a great relationship with God, I can read my Bible, I can pray, I can have Sundays to myself, and I don't have to deal with the messiness of the people in the church. Now, to my knowledge, please correct me if I'm wrong, this specific mentality is never directly addressed in the Bible. Now, of course, look, we've got plenty of teachings to say you need to be a part of the church. There's no reason you can't be a part of the church. You have to be part of the church if you're a Christian. But I don't know of anywhere that directly says, hey, by the way, some of you think that you can be a Christian without being part of the church, and that's ridiculous. You see what I'm getting at? Now, if Paul were to write a letter to the church today, he might very well include that in a letter. He might say, hey, by the way, some of you after COVID think that you can just stay home. You don't have to be a part of the church, and that's ridiculous. Now, if he were to write that to us today, would we say, well, that's just a cultural problem? No. It's transcultural, which means it goes across all the cultures. But our culture certainly needs to hear it, right? It is a universal truth that definitely needs to be heard in America because some Christians are having a struggle with that. So this is what I'm saying, and then we'll go together. Here's what Paul's doing. Ephesus has a problem with women abandoning the status quo, and they're living promiscuously, and they're taking some leadership positions that they shouldn't, and some who are weak, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6 and 7, are more susceptible to false teaching. And so I'm not sure if, because of cultural pressures, women are actively trying to take leadership roles in the church here in Ephesus, or if Paul is just aware of all these cultural pressures and reminds the church, hey, by the way, this is how women are to act in worship and operate within the church, and how they're not. However, Paul felt it necessary to say, and we are certainly aware of some cultural reasons that Paul might be thinking of, right? Like, this might be why he says that. But Paul provides a command that's for all of time. It's transcultural. Okay, so I say all that just because next week when we talk about this, some people are really going to hound on the culture. Say, well, we know all of this about culture. We know all of this about how these words are used. So because of that, we can only read the text in this cultural light, and it doesn't apply to anybody else. And what I'm saying is, sure, there's some culture that is necessary to know, and Paul's probably addressing some specific things in Ephesus, sure. But it's for everybody. It's for all of time. It's for every culture. And Ephesus just really needed to hear it. Okay, now, next week we'll actually get into the text. Remember all of those things when we get here next week. And please let me know if you have any comments or questions or want some notes and whatnot.